Charleston in the late 19th century moved with a rhythm that looked calm from a distance but jittered up close. The war had ended more than a decade ago, yet the city behaved as if every wall still needed to lean on old rules to avoid collapsing. The elite families clung to hierarchy because they had nothing else left to hold. Freedmen worked in domestic service, on docks, or in stables, technically liberated but still bound by dependency, wages, and the unspoken threat of retaliation. Everyone navigated an economy of reputation, a fragile, brittle currency. The Blackwood estate was smaller than it looked on paper. The grounds were decaying, but the family still entertained like they controlled half the coast. Their two-story house sat close to the harbor road, where visitors arriving by carriage were forced to see the home before they saw the city. Mr. Blackwood liked it that way. He believed visibility was influence. Inside the estate, Eleanor Blackwood made sure the illusion never cracked. She appeared in the main hallway each morning before the rest of the household was awake, moving quietly, checking whether the evening staff finished their duties. She lifted tablecloth edges to check for dust, straightened paintings by fractions of an inch, and inspected the brass railings for fingerprints. If she found marks, she didn't reprimand immediately. She waited until the responsible servant came into view, then called them over with a tone that was neither loud nor kind, a tone that erased excuses. "Polish beneath the rail as well," she said once to the young maid Clara, after pointing to a nearly invisible smudge. "If you clean only what others see, you miss what I see." Clara apologized quickly, head down. Eleanor accepted it with a nod that felt like a verdict. Those interactions defined her role. She did not need to shout. She controlled the house with precision and consistency, not aggression. Staff feared the consequences of disappointing her more than the consequences of disappointing the family. The Blackwoods gave Eleanor authority because she earned it, but also because they relied on her expertise. She knew every ingredient in the pantry, every herb that grew in the small back garden plots, every tincture stored in the cabinet she kept locked under her charge. She knew which families preferred which teas, which visiting relatives had stomach conditions, and which children tolerated honey better than sugar. Mrs. Blackwood often remarked, "Eleanor knows our lives better than we do." It was meant as praise, but among the staff, the sentence carried weight the mistress of the house didn't recognize. The day the first spark appeared began without visible disruption. Jonas Reed, the stable hand, arrived before sunrise to check on the horses. His movements were steady and methodical. He had been with the Blackwoods for 5 years, long enough to understand that domestic service was less about tasks and more about avoiding conflict. He kept his head down, worked precisely, and listened more than he spoke. That habit saved him more than once. As he fed the horses, he noticed movement near the pantry window, a silhouette, tall, straight-backed, pausing for a moment before disappearing deeper into the house. Eleanor. Jonas recognized her outline even in half-light. She inspected the kitchen before the cook arrived, counting jars, including those the staff pretended not to notice. She guarded with unusual vigilance. Jonas didn't assign meaning to the observation at the time. He simply filed it away as he did everything else. Inside, the morning routine unfolded with mechanical reliability. Clara chopped vegetables while glancing repeatedly toward the doorway, as if expecting Eleanor to appear at any moment. The cook muttered about dried thyme arriving late from the market. A footman carried a tray of linens to the upstairs rooms. Nothing looked unusual, but by late morning, a carriage had arrived at the Blackwood estate gate, the Harrow family's colors on its side. The Harrows were old Charleston money, older even than the Blackwoods. Their fortunes had weakened after the war, but their pride had not. Mrs. Harrow visited regularly to exchange gossip with Mrs. Blackwood about which families were recovering, which were failing, and which pretended to be fine. Eleanor prepared for the visit herself. She oversaw tea service, arranged a tray of pastries, and selected a jar of blackberry preserves prepared the week before. She handled the jar with the same care she used for everything else in the kitchen, calm, exact, deliberate. When the Harrow carriage door opened, Mrs. Harrow stepped out with her nephew, a thin young man who looked paler than usual. Mrs. Blackwood greeted them warmly, unaware of the tension the nephew carried in his shoulders. Eleanor moved between rooms like a quiet axis, ensuring everything flowed smoothly. She served the preserves during tea, offering them as a gesture of hospitality. Mrs. Harrow complimented them, noting their flavor. "This is Eleanor's doing," Mrs. Blackwood said proudly. "She handles our preserves now. Saves me endless trouble." Eleanor accepted the acknowledgement with her usual restrained nod. Later that afternoon, Jonas found Clara crouched behind the wood shed, her eyes wide and unsettled. "What happened?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. That's not nothing." Clara hesitated, then exhaled. "I shouldn't say. It's just, I don't like when she looks at me that way." "Who?" "You know who." Jonas didn't press. Everyone in the household knew exactly who she meant. But Clara wasn't usually nervous without cause. He waited quietly. "She had me fetch jars from the high shelf," Clara said. "Ones I don't usually touch. She stood behind me the whole time, watching, not saying a word. That's her job," Jonas said carefully. "No, this was something else. Like she wanted to see whether I'd take something. Or drop something." Jonas frowned. "You didn't, did you?" "Of course not." Her reaction was immediate and sincere. Jonas believed her. They both fell silent as footsteps approached. Eleanor walked past them without acknowledgement, though Jonas felt, with certainty, that she had noticed everything. By evening, word spread that the Harrow nephew had fallen ill shortly after returning home. Severe stomach pain, fever, vomiting, symptoms the Harrows described as sudden and violent. Their cook insisted the young man had eaten nothing questionable that day. Nothing except the blackberry preserves from the Blackwoods. No accusation was made. Not publicly. But gossip traveled fast among domestic workers. By nightfall, the staff at the Blackwood estate whispered quietly in corners. The cook repeated, half joking and half serious, "You know, people say her preserves last too long. Too perfect. Like nothing natural ever spoils that slowly." Clara's hands trembled as she cleaned the kitchen. Jonas noticed. "She can't hear us from here," he said. Clara didn't look convinced. "She gave them the preserves herself?" she whispered. "Not me, not the cook. Her." Jonas considered this. Eleanor rarely delivered food gifts personally. That task usually fell to footmen. He asked the question forming in his mind. "Did she say why she wanted you on the high shelf this morning?" Clara shook her head. She didn't say anything. Just watched. A long moment passed before Jonas replied. "Don't assume anything yet. We don't know what happened." Clara swallowed. "You weren't there. You didn't see how she looked at me." They both turned when they heard a door opening. Eleanor stepped into the kitchen, her posture composed, hands folded calmly in front of her. "Clara," she said, "prepare the evening inventory. Jonas, the stables need fresh straw before morning." Neither argued. They moved without hesitation. Eleanor remained still for a moment, studying them, her eyes following their movements with cold precision. Then she quietly locked the cabinet containing herbs, powders, and tinctures, a habit she justified as good housekeeping. But Jonas noticed something he had never seen before. She tested the lock twice. Later that night, Jonas sat alone in the stable, replaying the day's events. The Harrow illness could have been coincidence. People fell sick all the time. A spoiled ingredient, contaminated water, a mild infection, there were plenty of explanations. But he had also spent enough years around domestic workers across Charleston to know patterns. Rumors could be exaggerated, but they rarely grew out of nothing. Small stories circulated among servants. Eleanor's preserves, Eleanor's teas, Eleanor's remedies. They were always mentioned with caution, never accusation. Jonas rubbed his hands together slowly. The memory of Eleanor at dawn lingered, the way she inspected the pantry before anyone else arrived, the way she handled the jar that morning. Nothing about her actions openly revealed wrongdoing, but her control over the household went beyond ordinary authority. And control, he knew, often hid something. The next morning confirmed that the Harrow illness had not improved. The nephew was bedridden. Dr. Whitfield visited and said it might be a severe digestive infection, but his lack of certainty unsettled everyone. At the Blackwood estate, Mrs. Blackwood tried to maintain calm, but tension seeped through her composure. She asked Eleanor whether any ingredients in the preserves could cause illness. Eleanor answered with a steady tone. "No, ma'am. Everything was prepared correctly and sealed properly." The confidence in her voice made Mrs. Blackwood relax. But Jonas, listening from the hallway, felt something else, the hard certainty of someone who knew more than she declared. Clara remained quiet, avoiding Eleanor's gaze whenever possible. The cook moved more slowly than usual, as if afraid making a mistake would draw attention. Even the footman hesitated before speaking, measuring his words. Eleanor did not appear disturbed by the shift in atmosphere. She continued her routines with perfect normality, which only increased the unease. By afternoon, whispers from another estate reached the Blackwood staff. The Harrow family suspected outside influence. They didn't blame the Blackwoods directly, but the idea hung heavy. The only new factor in the nephew's diet had been the preserves Eleanor gifted. Clara overheard 2 workers from the neighboring Varnham estate discussing the illness. One of them said, "Harrow boy ain't the first to fall sick after those Blackwood sweets. People forget what happened at her last position." Clara repeated this to Jonas as soon as she found him. He stiffened. "What happened at her last position?" "They didn't say. They just said she left suddenly." Whole estate pretended it was normal. Jonas exhaled slowly. Stories grow on their own. Don't jump to conclusions. But Clara's fear was growing, not shrinking. "I'm telling you, she's watching me. And I don't know why." Jonas didn't respond. He was thinking about Eleanor testing the cabinet lock twice. That evening, Mrs. Blackwood sent Eleanor to deliver a message to the Harrow household expressing sympathy and offering to send more preserves if needed. Jonas watched Eleanor prepare the parcel. She selected jars carefully, avoiding 2 on the upper shelf and taking 1 from the lower row instead. When she left the kitchen briefly to retrieve her shawl, Clara leaned toward Jonas. "She swapped jars," Clara whispered. "Did you see? She avoided the ones she had me reach for yesterday." Jonas hadn't noticed that detail earlier, but now the difference felt significant. "You sure?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Yes." When Eleanor returned, she picked up the parcel with smooth confidence. No one stopped her. No one would dare. Mrs. Blackwood trusted her implicitly. As Eleanor walked out the door, her figure framed in the fading light, Jonas saw Clara shiver. The moment felt small and quiet, but something had unmistakably shifted. The first spark had already ignited. The consequences of the Harrow illness settled over Charleston faster than anyone anticipated. By the 3rd morning, the Harrow nephew's condition had worsened significantly, and Dr. Whitfield's uncertainty fed more rumors than any confirmed diagnosis could have. In a city where reputation was fragile and gossip traveled as efficiently as the coastal winds, people began quietly discussing the possibility of deliberate contamination. No one spoke the Blackwoods' name directly, but the timing, the visit, and the preserves were too neatly aligned for domestic workers to ignore. Within the Blackwood estate, the household carried on with its routines, but something fundamental had shifted. Mrs. Blackwood tried to speak cheerfully, but every sentence was strained, every instruction a beat too sharp. Mr. Blackwood withdrew into his study, issuing terse commands through the door. And through it all, Eleanor remained unchanged. Or perhaps, Jonas thought, She simply refused to reveal any reaction. Her posture, her tone, her precision in every task remained eerily steady, the way a locked drawer remains locked regardless of the chaos around it. Pressure rose almost immediately in the form of new household rules that Mrs. Blackwood announced during the morning meeting. Every ingredient had to be signed out and accounted for. Staff were required to keep written lists of what they handled during shifts. The kitchen door would now remain open at all times while preparations were underway, and fresh restrictions were placed on who could touch preserved goods. These rules looked like precautions on the surface, but they were built on suspicion directed downward, toward the workers, rather than upward toward the person who controlled the ingredients in the first place. Eleanor endorsed every new rule and refined several of them further, presenting her suggestions with polite confidence. She recommended additional labeling procedures, stricter separation of herbs, a reorganization of the pantry. Because she framed her changes as logical and responsible, the Blackwoods accepted them without question. No one seemed to notice, except Jonas, that each adjustment placed more control in her hands, not less. Clara, meanwhile, felt the pressure more intensely than anyone. Eleanor began assigning her jobs she never handled before, measuring specific powders for teas, checking jars for cracks, and preparing ingredients for social visits. These tasks required precision and confidence, and Clara had neither. She obeyed because refusing would be interpreted as incompetence, and incompetence was dangerous when suspicion was already spreading. Eleanor watched her closely during these tasks, never instructing her directly, but always present, always observing her movements with clinical attention. Clara grew so nervous she dropped a jar on the second day, and although it didn't break, Eleanor's silence afterward cut deeper than any reprimand. If she had shouted, Clara might have understood it. But the quiet analysis was worse, as if Eleanor was taking note of how fragile Clara could be under stress. Jonas noticed the change in Clara's behavior long before the Blackwoods did. She worked quickly but without rhythm, always glancing toward the corners of rooms as though expecting Eleanor to appear. She avoided walking alone through the pantry and often asked Jonas to accompany her even when it wasn't necessary. He agreed, not because he shared her fear, but because her distress was becoming too real to ignore. On the second evening after the Harrow illness worsened, Clara pulled Jonas aside near the stables and confessed in a rapid whisper that she'd heard footmen from the Varnam estate discussing parallels between the Harrow nephew's symptoms and those experienced by a Varnam aunt several years earlier. They said it was the same kind of fever, the same stomach pain, the same sudden collapse, Clara said, rubbing her hands nervously. And they said the Blackwoods had a jar of preserves delivered to them back then too. By Eleanor. Jonas didn't know whether to believe the story or dismiss it as another exaggerated rumor. Charleston's domestic community always made connections, some fair, some imagined, some merely convenient. But the detail about timing, the resemblance of symptoms, and the mention of preserves troubled him. It sounded too similar to ignore. He tried to reassure Clara, but he also warned her to stay calm, to avoid giving Eleanor any reason to single her out. Clara stared at him, eyes wide and terrified. She already has, she whispered. Over the following days, tension inside the estate escalated in direct proportion to the worsening crisis outside it. Dr. Whitfield returned to the Harrow residence multiple times and eventually admitted to the family that he could not confidently identify the cause of the illness. This uncertainty emboldened rumors. The Varnam family sent private inquiries to the Blackwoods asking whether anyone in the household had recently fallen sick. Another family sent a polite but suspiciously pointed note requesting the recipe used in Eleanor's preserves. Mrs. Blackwood, offended and alarmed, sent Eleanor to respond on her behalf. Eleanor wrote the letters with perfect politeness, maintaining the Blackwood dignity as if it were her personal responsibility to keep the estate's image intact. Meanwhile, internal fractures among the household staff grew deeper. Clara began confiding in Jonas more frequently, sometimes exposing details she probably shouldn't have known at all. Other staff members started avoiding direct involvement in kitchen duties. The cook privately admitted that she didn't like how firmly Eleanor controlled access to certain ingredients and mentioned, with lowered voice, that some jars in the storage cabinet looked slightly rearranged since the last inventory. She didn't accuse anyone explicitly, no one dared, but the implication was strong enough that Jonas felt the weight of it long after the conversation ended. And once that doubt took root, it became impossible to ignore the subtle changes in Eleanor's behavior. The way she hovered near certain drawers, the way she observed conversations, the way she studied reactions. It was as if she was measuring more than quantities in the pantry. She was measuring the people themselves. All of this was invisible to the Blackwoods, who trusted Eleanor's calmness as certainty. Mrs. Blackwood even began attributing the new order in the household to Eleanor's leadership. "Thank heaven she is with us," she said one morning after thanking Eleanor for reorganizing the spice cabinet. "With all this uncertainty, a steady head is needed." Jonas overheard this and felt a tightness in his chest. A steady head could easily be misunderstood. Eleanor's increased authority created new pressure on everyone. The new household rules required detailed tracking of activities, which made staff nervous even when they had done nothing wrong. Every movement felt recorded. Every mistake felt magnified. The fear of being blamed was thicker than the fear of illness itself. The moment it became known that Mrs. Blackwood had misplaced a kitchen ledger, she asked Eleanor to reconstruct the missing entries from memory, and Eleanor did so flawlessly. No one knew whether to admire or fear her ability to track so many details. The turning point came one afternoon when Jonas overheard Eleanor speaking quietly with Mrs. Blackwood about the need for greater responsibility in the lower staff. She didn't mention Clara by name, but her phrasing and timing left little doubt whom she meant. Eleanor suggested that a recent error in measuring herbs for tea had nearly caused a miscalculation. Mrs. Blackwood listened with concern, misunderstanding the implication as ordinary incompetence rather than deliberate framing. Jonas realized then that Eleanor was preparing something, perhaps preemptively shaping a narrative in case external suspicion found its way to the Blackwood estate. Convinced Clara needed to be warned, Jonas found her behind the laundry house, attempting to steady herself. He explained what he heard and urged her to consider leaving the estate quietly for a few days. Clara refused, not out of courage, but because she recognized the danger in absence. Disappearing would make her the prime suspect instantly. Eleanor would only need to raise an eyebrow, and the family would fill in the rest. "If I leave," Clara said, shaking slightly, "I'll be blamed for everything. She knows it, and she wants it." Her voice cracked in panic. Jonas considered going to Mrs. Blackwood directly, but he recognized the futility. Anything coming from a servant would be dismissed, especially if it implicated Eleanor, the one person the family trusted to maintain order. And even if he tried, he wasn't even sure he could articulate what he suspected. He had no evidence, only a collection of strange moments and uneasy observations. Nothing solid enough to accuse someone of poisoning. The crisis reached a new level when news spread that the Harrow nephew had not recovered but instead suffered a dramatic collapse. The Harrows sent for the doctor again, and by evening a messenger delivered the information that the young man was gravely ill and worsening. The message reached the Blackwoods during dinner. Mrs. Blackwood reacted with visible distress, and Mr. Blackwood cursed quietly, insisting that these infections appear out of nowhere nowadays. Eleanor stood behind the dining chair, pouring water into glasses with absolute composure. as if the news were no more alarming than a shipment delay. That same night, Jonas witnessed something that deepened his worry. He walked by the pantry on his way to return a storage key to the kitchen and saw Eleanor standing alone in the dim light, the cabinet door open, several small jars arranged in a precise line on the counter. She wasn't doing inventory. That had been completed earlier. She seemed to simply stand and study the jars one by one, occasionally lifting them to examine their contents against the lamp. Jonas paused just outside the doorway, unseen, and watched her rotate a jar slowly, almost thoughtfully. She didn't look like someone performing duties. She looked like someone calculating an outcome. When she finally closed and locked the cabinet, she tested the lock 3 times. It was the smallest detail, but it chilled Jonas more than any rumor could have. The next morning, the Blackwoods received an urgent note. The Varnam patriarch had fallen suddenly ill during a dinner hosted the previous night. The symptoms mirrored those of the Harrow nephew almost exactly. Panic spread through the network of elite families. Mrs. Blackwood paced the parlor, clutching the note with stiff fingers, while Mr. Blackwood insisted they organize their own medical examination just to be safe. Eleanor listened to these conversations without visible strain, offering to prepare a tonic for Mrs. Blackwood's anxiety. She prepared it in the kitchen with the same careful precision she used for everything. That was when Clara broke. She pulled Jonas aside and confessed in a trembling voice that she had seen Eleanor handling unusual powders again the night before. "She keeps them separate," Clara insisted. "She keeps them where she thinks I can't see, but I saw. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. And she knows I did. I'm sure of it." Her fear was raw and immediate. Jonas felt the full weight of the dilemma pressing down on him. If he ignored Clara's warnings, Clara might be blamed, punished, or accused in a way she could not protect herself from. If he confronted the Blackwoods directly, they would deny everything and possibly accuse him of stirring trouble. And if he confronted Eleanor, he did not know how she would respond, or what she might already have planned. The situation was no longer a whisper or a coincidence. The pressure had reached a point where silence itself became dangerous. The illness of the Harrow nephew and the sudden collapse of the Varnam patriarch were now connected, both by gossip and by symptoms. If one more wealthy family suffered a similar fate, no amount of reputation protection could contain the scandal. And Eleanor, whether guilty or innocent, was moving in a way that made Jonas believe she was far ahead of everyone else, predicting reactions, shaping interpretations, and positioning herself exactly where suspicion could be redirected. The story had stopped being a rumor. It had become a looming crisis, visible to anyone who dared look directly at it. And the next decision Jonas made, or failed to make, would alter the course of the entire household. The aftermath of the second family's poisoning sends Charleston's elite into a defensive frenzy, and the effects rippled down the social ladder with violent speed. By the time the sun rises the next day, the Hamilton estate feels like a sealed chamber. Armed patrols sweep the grounds in rotating shifts, their boots trampling the wet grass as if each blade might conceal a threat. Inside the household, every worker is questioned again, this time with narrower patience and sharper eyes. Eleanor stands at the center of it all, her posture rigid and her jaw tense, as if she is bracing herself for the impact of every accusation hurled in her direction. She answers in the same measured tone as always, but the overseer detects a flicker of something behind her calm. Whether fear or fury, he cannot tell. The air grows heavier each hour, as if the walls themselves anticipate the next strike in a war no one admits has begun. Suspicion now flows openly through the estate like a rising tide. Workers whisper in corners, watching one another with the cautious distance of people who know a single loose word could ruin them. The overseer feeds this tension deliberately. He imposes new restrictions, limits movement between buildings, and orders any communal cooking supervised by armed guards. When several enslaved workers protest that such surveillance makes their labor impossible, he cuts them off with the kind of cold certainty that brooks no argument. Eleanor, however, reacts differently. She quietly rewrites the work schedules, shifting kitchen duties away from those she believes the Hamiltons will target first. This choice angers some workers. Why should they bear the burden of suspicion for crimes they did not commit? But others recognize the necessity. Eleanor's decision is the first unmistakable sign that she has accepted her role as a buffer between the household's panic and the vulnerable people beneath it. It is a choice she cannot undo, and it begins to crack the careful neutrality she has maintained for years. In the neighboring estates, blame spreads with a kind of ruthless order. Old grievances between families resurface, disputes over shipments, land borders, inheritances, even past marriages. Each family searches for someone to accuse, and the name, Blackwood, resurfaces in more than one conversation. Rumors that Eleanor was present, years ago, when another family suffered a sudden illness return with new weight. The whispers become louder, gaining the authority of truth simply because so many people repeat them. Eleanor hears fragments of these accusations from a house servant who slips her a warning while polishing silverware. Though the girl says it quietly, with genuine concern, the message lands like a blow. Eleanor now knows that she is not simply overseeing a household in chaos. She is becoming the center of the story, whether guilty or not. The overseer, sensing opportunity, approaches the Hamilton patriarch with a proposal: limit Eleanor's authority, place stricter controls on her movements, or perhaps replace her entirely. But the patriarch hesitates, aware that the household's operations rely heavily on Eleanor's order. Her removal could collapse the entire structure. Yet this hesitation fuels the overseer's resentment, and when he returns to the workers' quarters, he begins enforcing discipline with a colder edge. Every perceived misstep becomes grounds for punishment. Workers feel the pressure tighten around them, and whispers of running away surface for the first time in months. Most know escape is nearly impossible, but fear makes the thought feel like a rational plan. Eleanor senses this shift and quietly warns several workers to stay calm, reminding them that those who attempted escape last year were caught within hours and beaten nearly to death. Her tone is not authoritarian, it is desperate. She understands that if anyone attempts flight now, it will be attributed to guilt, and the blame will circle back to her. The tension intensifies when a third incident strikes. This time the victim is not a wealthy patriarch, but a teenage son from the Whitmore family. He falls violently ill after a formal dinner hosted at the Hamilton estate. Within hours, rumors fly that someone tampered with beverages prepared by the household staff. The Whitmore overseer storms onto the property with his men, demanding access to the slave quarters, insisting on searching every bed, chest, and hidden space. The Hamiltons feel compelled to allow it, and the resulting raid turns into a spectacle of power: beds overturned, belongings smashed, workers shoved aside as their private lives are inspected for evidence that does not exist. Eleanor stands motionless through the ordeal, her face carved into unreadable lines. But inside she feels something break. She realizes that no logic, no explanation, no record of loyal service will protect her or anyone under her care. The accusations have gained momentum, and truth has become irrelevant to survival. In response to the raid, Eleanor calls 3 trusted workers aside, people who have known her long enough to understand that she does not speak impulsively. Behind the back wall of the kitchen, where the noise of washing carrots and chopping onions masks soft voices, she warns them that the situation is spiraling beyond containment. The workers exchange looks of disbelief. For years, Eleanor has maintained an almost unnatural level of composure, never revealing fear. To hear panic in her words unsettles them more than the overseer's threats. One of them, a stable hand with a scar down his arm, asks a difficult question. If she knows what is happening, why won't she tell them? Why not reveal who is responsible? His tone is not accusatory, but the implication hangs heavy. Eleanor stiffens. She insists she knows less than they imagine, yet the worker senses the evasion. His distrust reveals a fracture that has been forming quietly for weeks. This fracture widens when the Hamilton patriarch demands a full internal inquiry. Everyone, from kitchen workers to laundry staff to field hands, is required to list their daily activities from the week of the Whitmore dinner. The questioning drags on for hours in suffocating rooms where windows stay shut and tempers rise. Eleanor supervises the process and tries to guide the questioning away from vulnerable individuals, but her very involvement seems to feed suspicions. Workers resent her for being both part of their world and the world above them. They trust her less, and yet they rely on her more. This duality becomes unbearable, and one evening a worker confronts her privately. He tells her that if she knows how to stop this, she must act now, before someone innocent dies. Eleanor answers with frustration, revealing for the first time that she is not omniscient, not all-seeing, not all-controlling. The worker listens, but his expression reveals that fear has already reshaped his perception of her. Meanwhile, the upper-class families begin taking drastic steps to protect themselves. Some import their food from faraway suppliers, bypassing local kitchens entirely. Others forbid their children from visiting neighboring estates or attending gatherings. These restrictions send the message that the danger is real, imminent, and internal. Eleanor observes these shifts with a growing sense of inevitability. The community is preparing for a climax, a final act that will expose someone as a villain, whether or not that person deserves the role. The Hamilton patriarch, under pressure from other families and desperate to reclaim a sense of control, demands that Eleanor personally oversee all food preparation for every upcoming event. This command places her directly in the crosshairs of suspicion. If she refuses, it suggests she has something to hide. If she complies, she becomes the first person blamed when anything else goes wrong. Eleanor accepts the task with a steady voice but clenched fists. This decision marks the irreversible action that propels the story into its next phase. She knows that by stepping into this role, she is tethering herself to the unfolding disaster, binding her fate tightly to the chain of events that began long before she joined this household. As days pass under these new conditions, the moral question grows heavier. Is protecting the workers worth sacrificing her own safety? Is shielding the household worth reinforcing a corrupt system? Eleanor feels the weight of this dilemma each time she kneads bread under the watchful eyes of armed supervisors or inspects barrels of water, while knowing everyone around her wonders if she is guilty. She operates within a landscape where every choice has consequences beyond her control. Silence seems safer, but silence allows the system to devour more lives. Action feels necessary, but action risks igniting a confrontation she may not survive. The tension moves from the structural to the personal when the overseer corners Eleanor in the hallway outside the pantry late one night. He tells her plainly that he does not trust her, that he believes she knows more than she admits, and that if another incident occurs, he will not protect her. She holds his gaze without flinching, but internally she calculates the danger. His words are not a threat, they are a promise. This moment becomes a turning point in Eleanor's perception. She understands that the system will consume anyone, including those who enforce it. She realizes that survival now depends on anticipating the next escalation and preparing to face it directly, without illusions. By the end of this section, the estate has transformed into a pressure chamber where fear dominates every interaction. Workers speak in half-sentences. Overseers enforce rules with a cruelty disguised as protocol, and the Hamiltons cling to a fragile sense of authority. But beneath this surface, something more dangerous brews. Alliances forming in the dark, secrets ready to surface, and Eleanor's resolve hardening into a sharp, unyielding shape. The third poisoning marks the point of no return. The story moves toward its climax not because the danger is new, but because the consequences have finally become unavoidable. The final rupture begins on a humid evening when the Hamilton estate hosts a mandatory gathering for the heads of the three elite families still reeling from the poisonings. The purpose of the meeting is officially described as a discussion of household protocols, but everyone understands it as a trial in disguise, a private reckoning shielded from the public eye. Armed guards surround the property long before the first carriage arrives, and the usual rhythm of the estate is suspended. Workers are confined to the quarters, the kitchen is locked between supervised intervals, and no one is allowed to step into the main house unless summoned by name. Eleanor stands near the kitchen entrance with two guards positioned behind her, their rifles angled in her direction as if anticipating a sudden attack. The message is unmistakable. She is no longer a trusted figure, but a primary suspect invited only because the household requires her presence to enact whatever outcome the night demands. Inside, the parlor has been transformed from a room of genteel decor to something resembling a tribunal chamber. The family heads sit in rigid chairs arranged in a semicircle, their stiff posture conveying not unity, but mutual fear and resentment. Behind them stand their overseers, men chosen for loyalty over competence, each holding a leather ledger of supposed evidence. The Hamilton patriarch presides at the center, his face drained of its usual confidence. He appears older than he did weeks ago, his eyes marked by sleepless nights and an anxiety he struggles to disguise. When Eleanor is brought into the room, all heads turn toward her with the sharpness of people who believe they have finally found the source of their disaster. The questioning begins with a veneer of civility. One family head asks Eleanor to recount the preparation timeline for the Whitmore dinner. Another presses for details about which workers handled the wine decanters. Eleanor answers with precise recollection, but she knows the accuracy of her statements is irrelevant. The men have already decided that someone within the Hamilton household orchestrated the poisoning, and she is the most convenient vessel for their anger. As the questioning continues, it becomes clear that the purpose is not to discover truth, but to corner her into contradictions. When she refuses to alter her account to suit their expectations, irritation simmers among the men. The Whitmore patriarch demands harsher interrogation, insisting that the recent loss of his son requires decisive action. The room tightens with moral pressure masquerading as righteous indignation, and Eleanor feels herself being pushed toward an outcome carefully engineered long before this gathering began. The overseer, who has been waiting for his moment, steps forward with a folded paper he presents as key evidence. He claims it is a note discovered in the workers' quarters describing the symptoms of certain toxins. He argues that Eleanor, given her managerial role and access to the household's pantry and medicinal supplies, could have directed others or acted alone. His voice grows more forceful with each sentence, revealing a personal vendetta disguised as objective reporting. Eleanor realizes instantly that the note is fabricated, its handwriting unfamiliar, its language inconsistent with the education level of any worker in the estate. But when she points out these discrepancies, the overseer counters that such precision suggests premeditation rather than innocence. The patriarchs murmur among themselves, their distrust gaining momentum. Eleanor understands that logic will not save her. The men are not searching for answers. They are searching for closure, a scapegoat to soothe their family's fears and protect their reputations. Outside the parlor, workers pressed against the walls strain to hear snippets of the proceedings. The atmosphere in the quarters is suffocating. Some fear Eleanor will be taken and tortured, and they brace themselves for retaliatory punishment if the families decide to demand confessions by force. Others whisper about whether she truly could have been involved in the poisonings. Doubt, once a quiet undercurrent, now surfaces openly, dividing the group. Those who have known Eleanor longest defend her, insisting she has never harmed anyone under her watch. Yet the fear of being associated with a condemned figure pushes others to distance themselves. Even among the enslaved community, alliances fracture as survival instincts take precedence over loyalty. Back inside, the Hamilton patriarch announces that the time for discussion has ended and that a final determination must be made before the night concludes. He orders Eleanor to be escorted to the dining hall, a space large enough for the overseers to conduct a search of her belongings and examine the tools she uses daily. The men follow closely behind her, forming a procession that feels less like an inquiry and more like a march toward judgment. The dining hall, usually adorned for formal meals, now stands stripped of table settings and decorations. The emptiness gives it the stark feeling of a punishment chamber. Eleanor is ordered to stand at the room's center, while overseers rifle through cabinets and drawers, pulling out pots, bottles, herbs, and jars as if each item contains proof of her guilt. Their movements grow increasingly aggressive, with objects tossed aside or shattered on the floor. When they find a small container of medicinal compounds used for treating stomach ailments, the overseer triumphantly holds it up as evidence, claiming it matches substances identified in the victims' bodies. Eleanor explains, with steady voice, that the compounds are standard remedies routinely used in the household for years. The men ignore her explanation. Their determination to incriminate her overshadows any interest in context. The confrontation escalates when one overseer steps forward and declares that Eleanor must confess to either acting alone or conspiring with others. He warns that denying involvement will force them to extract the truth through harsher means. The threat is not ambiguous. Eleanor sees the overseer's hands shift toward their belts, where whips and restraints are kept. She also sees, in the patriarch's expressions, a willingness to allow violence as long as it produces a clean resolution. Yet before any order is issued, one of the younger workers bursts into the hall. His face is pale, his breath short, but his voice is unwavering as he announces that another victim has fallen ill, this time on a neighboring estate, and that the symptoms began while the meeting was still underway. The news lands with the force of a physical blow. The men freeze, processing the implications. If the poisoning continued while Eleanor was detained under heavy watch, the theory of her direct involvement collapses. The patriarchs demand proof, and the worker provides it. A messenger from the neighboring estate witnessed the sudden illness and immediately came to warn the Hamiltons. Confusion crashes over the room. The overseers argue that Eleanor could still be responsible through hidden accomplices, but their certainty falters. The timing undermines their narrative. The Hamilton patriarch orders the meeting to pause while the new information is verified. Overseers race outside to confirm the report, leaving Eleanor standing in the wreckage of the dining hall. The temporary silence presses against her, revealing a truth she has suspected for weeks. The poisonings are part of a larger system of revenge or internal conflict within the elite families, one that has nothing to do with her or the workers. She realizes she has been caught in a crossfire of secrets she was never meant to see. When the overseers return, their expressions confirm the report's accuracy. A woman from the neighboring estate is in critical condition, and her symptoms match those of previous victims. The patriarchs, now shaken, turn their suspicion inward. They begin arguing among themselves, accusing each other of withholding information, manipulating evidence, or orchestrating the poisonings to destabilize rival families. The confrontation shifts from Eleanor to the men themselves, revealing fractures in their alliances that have been hidden beneath a veneer of social unity. The overseer, desperate to salvage his accusations, continues pressing the case against Eleanor, but the patriarchs no longer give him their full attention. They demand answers from one another, raising their voices, stepping closer, letting long-standing grievances flare. The dining hall transforms into a battleground of privilege and fear, with Eleanor standing at its volatile center. The situation reaches a breaking point when the Whitmore patriarch, overwhelmed by rage and grief, draws a pistol and points it not at Eleanor, but at the Hamilton patriarch. He accuses him of orchestrating the poisonings to weaken the Whitmore family and seize control of contested land. The accusation seems irrational, but grief makes it believable to the man speaking it. Chaos erupts. Overseers scramble to intervene. Guards rush into the room, and workers listening from the hallway scatter as shouts echo through the estate. The tension that has been building for weeks finally ignites in a moment of raw human desperation. The Hamilton patriarch manages to deflect the pistol, but in the struggle, the weapon discharges, sending a deafening crack through the hall. No one is hit, but the shot shatters the last remnants of order. Guards disarm the patriarch and restrain him, but the incident confirms that the elite families have lost control. Their panic, once directed outward at the workers, now cannibalizes their relationships with one another. Eleanor, still surrounded by guards, watches the scene unfold with a clarity that surprises even her. She understands that the system she has served for years is collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The poisonings may have been the spark, but the true rot has always been the fear, deception, and brutal hierarchy that govern the family's existence. In the aftermath of the pistol shot, the patriarchs attempt to regain composure, but their authority is irreparably damaged. They end the meeting abruptly, declaring that the investigation will continue privately. Yet their tone lacks conviction. They have lost confidence in their control, and their departure from the estate is marked by hurried steps instead of dignified pace. The guards release Eleanor, but the overseer watches her with a smoldering hatred that promises retaliation. The workers, now released from confinement, gather around her with a mixture of relief and dread, unsure whether her narrow escape has improved their future or painted an even larger target on their backs. That night, the estate sits in a state of fragile, dangerous silence. The patriarch's conflict has erupted into the open, but the system of power remains intact, wounded but not defeated. The overseer prowls the grounds, furious that his attempt to break Eleanor failed. Workers whisper about what will happen next, aware that the families, feeling exposed and humiliated, may resort to even harsher measures to reassert control. Yet beneath their fear lies a quiet, growing recognition that the power structure is no longer invincible. Its leaders have shown themselves to be vulnerable, desperate, and deeply fractured. Eleanor sits alone in her quarters, replaying every word from the confrontation. She realizes that survival now requires a decisive choice. Remaining silent will allow the families to rebuild their control and place blame wherever it suits them. Speaking out, however, risks triggering a final backlash that could cost her life. The moral question at the heart of her ordeal stands before her with unbearable clarity. Is protecting herself worth allowing the truth to remain buried? Or is pursuing justice worth the danger that will surely follow? As she weighs these options, she understands that the next step will determine not only her fate, but the fate of everyone under her watch. The climax ends not with a resolution, but with a brutal, unavoidable truth. The system that governs Charleston is far more dangerous than any individual poisoning. And the final confrontation has only just begun. The morning after the failed tribunal, the Hamilton estate feels as if a storm has passed without clearing the air. The soil outside is unbroken, the buildings still stand, and the routine tasks of labor continue, but every person on the grounds moves with the tense awareness that nothing has truly settled. The patriarch's departure left the household in an unstable state of suspended judgment. No verdict, no punishment, no closure. Workers step carefully around overseers, trying to decipher whether the danger has increased or simply changed shape. The overseer himself stalks through the property with a brittle, simmering frustration. He masks it with forced discipline, extra inspections, additional headcounts, abrupt commands delivered with clipped intensity. He is a man denied the outcome he expected, and the denial corrodes his judgment. Eleanor, though free of physical restraints, carries the invisible weight of the night's events. She knows that the families are regrouping behind closed doors, examining their own alliances and recalculating their risks. Some will blame the Hamilton patriarch for the chaos. Others will accuse the Whitmores of hysteria. All of them will search for a narrative that protects their reputations. Yet beneath their private deliberations lies a growing fear. The poisonings continued despite a coordinated attempt to contain them, and the implications extend far beyond household management. The elite family's control, long treated as unquestionable, is beginning to look precarious even to themselves. Eleanor senses this shift, but she is not comforted by it. The collapse of order in a system built on dominance rarely leads to liberation. More often, it invites desperate, unpredictable retaliation. In the workers' quarters, people gather in small groups, speaking in low voices as they review the confrontation that nearly destroyed Eleanor. Some express shock that the patriarchs turned on each other. Others point out that the chaos could just as easily have resulted in mass punishment for the workers. The community is divided in its interpretation of what happened. For some, Eleanor's survival proves her innocence. For others, it proves nothing. They have seen innocent people survive abuse and guilty people escape consequences. The fear of being caught in the crossfire remains strong, and the debate over whether to protect Eleanor, distance themselves from her, or prepare for the worst grows louder in private discussions. The younger workers are particularly torn. They admire her resilience, but worry that staying close to her might draw unwanted scrutiny. The older workers, who have lived through countless cycles of suspicion and control, insist that the safest path is calm obedience until the families make their next move. Meanwhile, the news of the latest poisoning spreads through Charleston with unusual speed. The victim from the neighboring estate remains in critical condition, and her illness has caused panic among the upper class. Merchants receive urgent orders for imported food and bottled water. Carriages speed between estates at all hours as the families exchange rumors and accusations. The local physician, pressured by multiple households, issues contradictory statements, first suggesting the poisonings might be accidental contamination, then hinting at deliberate sabotage. These inconsistencies only deepen the community's fear. Within days, Charleston transforms from a network of confident elite families into a landscape of suspicion where everyone believes danger hides within their own walls. The Hamilton patriarch, after conferring with his overseers, calls Eleanor to his office for a private meeting. The room feels smaller than usual, its windows closed and its lamps turned low. He studies her with a mixture of exhaustion and distrust, as if he cannot decide whether she is a threat or a resource. He informs her that until the poisoner is found, she will be placed under restricted duties. She may continue supervising kitchen operations, but only under direct observation by at least one overseer at all times. Eleanor recognizes this for what it is, a controlled reinstatement, a way to retain her skills while keeping her under suspicion. She accepts the terms without argument, aware that refusal would only deepen the patriarch's doubts. As she leaves the office, she sees the overseer watching with a thin, victorious smile. Although the patriarch no longer supports a full accusation, the overseer has secured permission to increase surveillance over her, a tool he intends to use with precision. Yet despite the restrictions, Eleanor still holds influence among the workers, and that influence becomes the overseer's main point of resentment. Over the next few days, he seizes every opportunity to limit her interactions. He reroutes messages so that workers must report directly to him instead of going through her, disrupts the schedule she creates, and inserts himself into tasks he previously ignored. These actions confuse the workflow, causing delays and mistakes that he then uses as justification for further punishments. Eleanor watches this pattern unfold, understanding that the overseer's goal is to isolate her until she becomes the easiest person to blame for the unrest that continues to fester. She knows, too, that the workers are aware of his tactics. They see the imbalance growing, and although many remain loyal to her, the pressure is wearing them down. The fragile equilibrium shatters when word arrives that the woman from the neighboring estate has died. Her death marks the fourth poisoning, and it sends the elite families into full crisis mode. Rumors now suggest that the poisoner may be someone with deep access to domestic operations across multiple estates. Theories circulate: a disgruntled servant, a dismissed worker seeking revenge, a jealous family member targeting rivals, or even a coordinated act of rebellion. These theories are discussed not in whispers, but in long, heated arguments among the patriarchs. The uncertainty terrifies them. If the poisoner is one of their own or someone they overlooked, the danger is far greater than anything they imagined. In their desperation, they turn again to the Hamilton estate, the place where the illnesses began, and demand a renewed investigation. This time, however, the investigation takes a different form. Instead of focusing solely on Eleanor, the families announce they will inspect the workers' quarters across all estates, beginning with the Hamiltons. This declaration prompts immediate panic among the workers. They have already endured one raid, and some still bear bruises and scars from the overseer's careless searches. Eleanor understands that another inspection could lead to violence, especially now that the families are more desperate. She tries to prepare the workers, advising them to hide nothing and to keep their answers simple. But her guidance is overshadowed by the fear saturating the quarters. People pack their few possessions tightly, as if bracing for confiscation. Conversations shift from speculation to survival strategies. Some consider fleeing into the woods, despite knowing the consequences for runaway attempts. Others urge staying put, arguing that those who run will be hunted and that those who remain loyal may be spared. Eleanor listens to every argument, seeing the fear tearing the community apart. When the patriarchs arrive with overseers and guards, the raid begins with aggressive force. Rooms are emptied, furniture overturned, floorboards examined for hidden compartments. Workers are lined up in the yard as overseers interrogate them one by one. The Hamilton overseer takes particular pleasure in questioning anyone known to be close to Eleanor. He asks deliberately leading questions, implying secret meetings, hidden messages, or coordinated plans. The workers feel the trap closing around them and try to answer carefully, but their caution only fuels his suspicion. The turning point comes when the overseer, after failing to find anything incriminating in the quarters, orders a search of Eleanor's private space. Although she lives under the same constraints as the workers, her room is isolated from theirs, and its contents are sparse: a table, a bed, a chest with a few essentials. The overseer rummages through everything, tossing her clothes aside, scattering her belongings across the floor. When he finds nothing useful, he smashes the legs of her table in frustration, splintering the wood. The patriarchs watch in silence, offering no reprimand. Eleanor remains calm throughout the ordeal, even as her few possessions are destroyed. Her composure unsettles the overseer, He wanted her fear, not her stillness. He steps closer and demands to know why she is not panicking. She looks at him with an expression that is neither defiant nor submissive, simply tired. The overseer interprets her silence as insolence and raises his hand to strike her. Before the blow lands, a voice interrupts. A worker who steps forward and declares that Eleanor cannot be responsible for the poisonings. His voice trembles, but he speaks with courage that surprises even himself. He recounts her actions during the first incident, her reassignments that protected vulnerable workers, her warnings to remain calm, her efforts to maintain order. He argues that someone intent on murder would not work so hard to prevent chaos. His testimony prompts murmurs among the other workers, who begin voicing their own accounts. One describes how Eleanor intervened when the overseer punished a stable hand weeks earlier. Another recounts seeing her questioned harshly during the tribunal. The workers' statements do not exonerate her with evidence, but they humanize her in a way that disrupts the overseer's narrative. Their unified voices create a moment of moral clarity that the overseer cannot immediately crush. The patriarchs, faced with this collective defense, hesitate. They are not moved by compassion, but by pragmatism. If Eleanor truly commands such loyalty, punishing her might trigger further unrest. And with poisoning still occurring, they cannot afford more instability. They silently agree to end the raid and withdraw, but their decision offers no real safety. They are retreating only to regroup, not to abandon suspicion. After the patriarchs depart, the estate enters a period of strained quiet. The overseer, enraged by the workers' defiance, vows privately to regain control. He increases surveillance, shortens rest periods, and reports minor infractions to the patriarch with exaggerated detail. The workers feel the consequences immediately, but they also feel a subtle shift in their own behavior. For the first time, they have acted collectively to defend one of their own against a system that expected silent obedience. This act does not erase their fear, but it plants a sense of shared resilience that the overseer's retaliation cannot fully extinguish. As days pass without another poisoning, the elite families cautiously resume their routines. Publicly, they claim that the threat has subsided because of their decisive actions. Privately, they remain haunted by the knowledge that the poisoner was never caught. Some quietly relocate their children to relatives' homes. Others petition for increased patrols or stricter laws governing labor and movement. Their fear transforms into policy, reinforcing the very system that allowed the disaster to unfold. They rewrite the narrative to portray themselves as vigilant protectors rather than frightened men who nearly killed an innocent woman. For the workers, the aftermath is quieter but more profound. The memory of the raid lingers, and many avoid speaking about Eleanor in public spaces. Yet in private moments, their conversations turn reflective. They discuss the fragility of the system that governs their lives and the unpredictable violence it can unleash. Some workers believe the poisonings were carried out by someone from the upper class, a member of a family seeking revenge or power. Others argue that it must have been someone outside the estates entirely, taking advantage of the chaos. Theories multiply, but answers remain elusive. Eleanor herself becomes a figure both present and distant. She continues her duties, but something in her demeanor has changed. She no longer moves with the same sharp precision that once defined her authority. She now carries a quiet, measured restraint, as if she is conserving energy for a future reckoning she knows may still come. Workers approach her with gratitude, but she responds with a humility that signals how deeply the ordeal has scarred her. She understands that survival required more than her strength. It required the community's willingness to protect her, even at their own risk. In the months that follow, the story of the poisonings becomes part of Charleston's whispered history. The elite families recount it selectively, shaping the narrative to suit their reputations. Some blame strangers. Others blame former workers. None admit their own failures, infighting, or cruelty. Their version of events becomes a warning tale, told not to seek truth, but to reinforce obedience among those beneath them. Among the workers, the story becomes something different. They tell it quietly, passing it through generations not as a tale of violence, but as a testament to resilience. Of a community that, even under brutal circumstances, found the courage to protect one another when the system tried to turn them against each other. Eleanor's name becomes part of that memory, not as a martyr or a hero, but as a symbol of how easily power can misinterpret silence, strength, and leadership. In the final reflection, the question that haunts the story remains unresolved. What does justice look like in a world built on lies? The poisonings exposed the fractures within Charleston's elite, but they did not dismantle the system that enabled their cruelty. The truth was never uncovered, and those who suffered never received recognition or restitution. Yet the story endures because it reveals a deeper truth, that history is shaped not only by the powerful, but by the quiet decisions, the whispered warnings, the moments of courage and solidarity among those who lived under the weight of oppression. For a modern audience, the tale stands as a reminder that systems of power rarely collapse from external threats. They crumble from within, eroded by fear, suspicion, and the lies people tell to protect themselves. And when history is retold, the question is not only what happened, but whose version becomes the legacy.